The remains of Pompeii's victims were cast in plaster in the 19th century in order to preserve them. But the dense casts also made it difficult for researchers to analyze the bones and teeth inside, which is why the team had to use a 16-layer scan machine.
What AI discovered in the CT scans of Pompeii victims is still a mystery to archaeologists. They only anticipated sharper photos of the bones. Rather, what they saw on their screens made even seasoned researchers pause for a moment. The algorithms started to uncover hidden patterns and minute characteristics inside the plaster molds.
Did the Pompeii victims suffer? This is actually a horrible question to answer because in many cases the answer is yes, people did suffer.
What had appeared to be a metropolis trapped in time, abruptly transformed into a live repository of human survival, anatomical features, and suffering from almost 2 millennia ago, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. On August 24, 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius exploded. It caused one of the worst natural catastrophes in European history. Although the volcano, which towers over the Bay of Naples, had begun to show signs of restlessness in the preceding days, few could have foreseen the extent of the impending devastation. A massive column of gas, pumice, and ash was expelled by Vesuvius, starting at lunchtime, and soared more than 30 kilometers into the skies. A rain of volcanic debris covered the nearby cities for about 18 hours, covering Pompeii with several meters of pumice. The penultimate and most destructive stage occurred early the following morning when a sequence of pyroclastic surges, superheated currents of gas, and ash that were over 300 degrees Celsius swept across the city, killing almost everyone that was left. There were between 10,000 and 12,000 people living in Pompeii. Approximately 2,000 of these were killed in the eruption. As they attempted to escape, many of them got entangled in houses, gardens, and streets. Life in Pompeii was frozen in a moment of silence because to the abruptness of the devastation. While the extreme heat carbonized organic material, from wooden beams to bread still baking in ovens, buildings, furnishings, and even food were buried beneath the ash. Pompeii is unique not only because of the tragedy, but also because of the subsequent level of preservation. Decomposing bodies were encased in fine volcanic ash, which solidified to form hollow chambers that preserved the victims' precise outlines. These gaps eventually turned into spectral silhouettes, unfavorable perceptions of the deceased. When Giuseppe Fiorelli, an Italian archaeologist, took over excavations in 1863, he invented a technique that revolutionized site analysis. Fiorelli and his team created intricate castings that preserved facial emotions, clothing folds, and even the positions of hands, protecting faces by pouring liquid plaster into these spaces. These plaster representations, which provided a direct and personal look at human misery preserved in time, rose to become some of the most eerie objects of ancient archaeology. More than 100 of these victims were discovered in Pompeii using the plaster cast technique, and later in neighboring communities like Oplontis and Herculaneum. Every cast symbolized a distinct moment of death, such as a man collapsing in mid-step, a couple clasped in an embrace, or a kid curled in slumber. These shapes were mostly examined visually for more than a century, which resulted in a plethora of beliefs on gender, occupation, and cause of death. Despite their vividness, the casts were merely surface-level pictures. Without damaging the casts themselves, it was impossible to reach the skeletal remnants, which were still covered in plaster. A non-invasive way to examine within was not made possible by technology until the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In order to examine the remains within the castings without causing any harm, archaeologists and bioanthropologists have been using sophisticated imaging technology since the early 2000s. The most important innovation has been computed tomography, or CT scanning. Researchers at organizations like the Archaeological Park of Pompeii, the University of Naples Federico II, and the Italian National Research Council have created high-resolution 3D models of bones and teeth concealed. Within the plaster, using this medical grade, imaging radiologist Stefano Vanacore and his team conducted a thorough CT examination in 2015, scanning dozens of casts, including some of the best-preserved corpses discovered in the Garden of the Fugitives. Unexpected findings from the scans included entire skulls, aligned vertebrae, and even dental enamel that gleamed in cross-section. The findings demonstrated that the inhabitants of Pompeii had generally good oral health, with few cavities and indications of a diet high in fiber and low in refined sugar. This disproved past theories that lower-class Romans lacked proper nourishment. Simultaneously, researchers started removing and analyzing ancient DNA from the skeletal bones. Even though the volcanic debris was destructive, it had produced an atmosphere that was perfect for retaining genetic material because it was low in oxygen and microbial activity. The first entire genome ever retrieved from a Pompeian victim was reported in a study that was published in Scientific Reports in 2022. The remains were discovered at the house of the craftsman and belonged to a man and a woman. The individual had spinal tuberculosis, also known as Pott's disease, according to genetic sequencing, which is one of the first genomic confirmations of the condition in archaeological history. Researchers from the Italian Ministry of Culture, Sapienza University of Rome, and the University of Copenhagen conducted additional DNA study that compared a number of people who were thought to be related. The results disproved long-held beliefs. The same has been accomplished by combining 3D images with AI-assisted reconstruction. We'll examine the Pompeii victims from a whole other angle today. Results of CT scanning and imaging. An important milestone in the study of human remains preserved under unusual circumstances was reached when computed tomography, or CT, technology was initially applied to the plaster casts of Pompeii's victims. For the first time, a complete internal map of the plaster figures was made possible by these CT scans, which showed skeleton remnants, individual ornamentation, and even the elaborate layering of plaster and ash that covered them. A Siemens Somatom definition, flash CT scanner, which can generate more than 1,000 slices per second and achieve spatial resolutions as low as 0.6 millimeters, was used to perform the work. Several of the most well-known people were included in the scans, including those from the Garden of the Fugitives, a location on Pompeii's southern edge where 13 victims were discovered huddled together beneath 3 meters of volcanic debris. In these instances, the CT scan showed that the jawbones, skulls, and spines were all intact, and the teeth were remarkably clear. With the use of this information, forensic experts were able to rebuild the people's physical characteristics, including height, age, and health indicators, with an unprecedented level of precision. The dental analysis produced one of the first and most unexpected findings. According to the CT scans, the majority of victims had teeth that were very well preserved, with almost no periodontal disease, worn molars, and few cavities.
Mount Vesuvius preserved the shapes of its victims at Pompeii, but while these shapes remain at the site today, bones and teeth are all that's left of the people inside.
Long-held beliefs that lower-class Roman inhabitants suffered from chronic starvation and poor cleanliness were called into question by this discovery, which was made public in 2016 by radiologist Stefano Vanacore and his colleagues. The absence of dental decay indicated a diet low in refined sugars and high in coarse grains, which is in line with what is known about Roman diets prior to the widespread use of processed sweeteners. Furthermore, many people were robust and physically active, as seen by their well-developed bone structure and muscular attachment points, defying the notion that the Roman poor were weak or ill. There were no indications of a chronic calcium deficit in the bone density values taken from the CT scan. Additionally, information about attire, jewelry, and even final activities were disclosed by the internal pictures. In a number of instances, metallic remains from rings and clasps lodged in the plaster that were imperceptible to the human eye were found by CT scans. These remnants assisted in verifying the victim's personal belongings and social standing at the time of death. More remarkably, the scans gave anthropologists the ability to identify a person's age and sex based on their skull traits and pelvic morphology. Several incorrect identifications made by early excavators were rectified by this knowledge. Archaeologists frequently deduced gender from surface features alone in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Larger, more muscular shapes were deemed male, while smaller figures or draped castings were classified as female. Several of these identifications turned out to be incorrect, according to the CT data. In one instance, the skeleton of a man in his mid-30s was discovered inside a cast that had previously been shown as a young mother protecting a kid. On the other hand, a figure that was initially believed to be male turned out to be female. Earlier researchers had created stories about couples, wives, and kids dying together because numerous casts were discovered in groups. Some of those reconstructions were called into question by the CT evidence, which revealed that individuals of all ages and sexes frequently passed away together without obvious family connections. DNA study later supported this interpretation. CT scans reveal information about the victims' last moments in addition to their gender and health. Many casts include twisted limbs and faces that appear to be frozen in pain, giving 19th century onlookers the impression that the victims may have suffocated in poisonous gas or endured lengthy suffering. But the high-resolution pictures told a different tale. The victims' contracted arms, arched backs, and curled fingers all resembled what forensic specialists refer to as the pugilistic attitude, which is a posture brought on by extreme heat rather than deliberate action. When subjected to temperatures higher than 250 to 300 degrees Celsius, muscular tissue contracts and dehydrates, causing the limbs to fold inward in a boxer-like position. These sites were linked to exposure to pyroclastic surges that reached fatal temperatures of more than 500 degrees Celsius, instantly killing victims, according to CT scans. The earlier assumption that gradual asphyxiation was the primary cause of death was refuted by this evidence. Additionally, thermal fracture patterns in bones were captured by the same scans. The instantaneous death model is further supported by these microscopic fissures, which are compatible with exposure to intense heat rather than severe damage. Before the plaster was applied centuries later, soft tissue may have evaporated upon coming into contact with the hot ash, as evidenced by the occasional discovery of air pockets and microbubbles inside the plaster layers. The knowledge of Pompeii's deceased was changed from static icons of tragedy to comprehensive biological and historical data in just over 20 years thanks to CT scanning, genetic surprises, and DNA analysis. The victims of Mount Vesuvius's eruption in AD 79 remained unidentified for almost 2 millennia, with only physical impressions left in ash being used to reconstruct their lives. Although radiography imaging and CT scans provided insights into their anatomy, the subject of their true identity remained unresolved. What AI revealed inside the plaster of Pompeii's dead wasn't just data. It was a whisper from nearly 2,000 years ago. Behind those frozen faces were people, healthy, strong, and alive, until a single moment turned them into statues of ash. Now, every scan tells their final heartbeat, every pixel a secret that time tried to erase. But with each discovery, new questions rise. Were these people preserved by tragedy, or chosen by history to tell us something we're still too afraid to see? The more AI uncovers, the less certain we become. This is not the end of Pompeii's story. It's the beginning of one that might rewrite everything we thought we knew about life, death, and the fire that still burns beneath the ashes.